Holy is a God nature that begins to set you apart. That's why we are sanctified. That's the process of being set apart for a special usage of God. It's not just the common usage. Holy is something that's not common anymore, but it's uncommon. It's something that has speciality to it in the eyes of God. And he says, I want you to present your bodies a living sacrifice. How are we going to give ourselves as a living sacrifice? It starts with holiness. Without holiness, you can never be a sacrifice. When they brought them lambs to the temple, and they brought them goats to the temple, they brought them turtle doves, and they brought them pigeons, and they brought that grain, then priests looked it over. They washed those animals, and then they run their hands all in the places you couldn't see to see if they could feel any blemish, maybe a scar that they had got when they were young, and the skin was raised, and they'd say, I'm sorry, you can't sacrifice that. Or maybe there was an eye that didn't see quite right, or maybe there was a hoof that was just a little bit smaller than the other. Everything had to be symmetrically perfect. And if God required that of animals, how much more does He require of those that are made in His image, who He has shed His blood? It is important how we conduct ourselves, what kind of lifestyle we have, how we dress, how we talk, what we allow ourselves to be involved in. I know that some people don't think that holiness is important, or they want to say holiness is just an attitude of God in us or a nature of God, and then this dress and this lifestyle are just disciplines. My friend, that is as stupid as you can get to believe. That's like trying to say that an apple or an orange or a pomegranate is not part of the tree that it's growing on because it doesn't look like the bark and it's not part of the root. My friend, from the very seed that goes in the ground, to the roots that grow out, to the trunk that comes up, to the branches, the leaves, to the budding of the little knobs that turn into the fruit, that's all part of the tree. You shall know them by their fruits. That means you're going to know what kind of tree a tree is by the fruit that is hanging on the branches. You know why I know a rose bush is a rose bush? Because it produces roses. You know why I know an orange tree is an orange tree? Because it produces oranges. You know why I know a walnut tree is a walnut tree? Because it produces walnuts. How in the world are they going to know that you're a holy person if there ain't no holy fruit being produced in your life? You got to have the fruit of holiness. And he said, present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God. In other words, if you're not holy, acceptable to God doesn't work in your life. God says, I'm not going to accept that blemish of unholiness in this life. Just as the priests run their hand along that lamb and said, I'm sorry, we find that there is a little bitty scar of raised tissue here, or it looks like that this eye's dropped a little bit, or there's something, a deficit in this eye. You'll have to bring another one because we can't offer that to God. And yet we have the boldness to walk in and give God the second best, the unholiness of our life, and the worst of God, and say, here, God, take it or leave it. And God says, it's unacceptable. I won't take it. Oh, you need me, God. He says, I do need you, but not at the cost of unholiness. I do want you in my church, but not at the cost of blemishes in your spirit. I got to have a righteous and a holy and a godly people that will do what He wants us to do if He's going to build the church that He wants to build. And the devil comes in and he tries to tell you, oh, that's not what God means. That ain't that important. That's just some old traditions from another generation that you're trying to hang on to. That's just, that's just a church world mentality, but you got to get up to times. Everything's relevant. And I can agree only that everything is relevant when it's put up against this book. And if it doesn't match to this, then it's not relevant. It's out of style. It's out of time. It has no relativity to the life of humanity if it doesn't line up to the book. Now, I don't know what book they're using when they try and get by with all the stuff they're bringing in and trying to fill the lives of Christians, but it sure ain't this book that I'm holding in my hands. This book is clear. It gives a certain sound. It has a trumpet that is loud and clear. And if you'll read it in the Spirit in a prayerful attitude and humility, it'll change your life. It'll give you direction. This is the Word of God. And so he said, we can't serve God without sacrifices. We can't serve God with burnt offerings. What's the use of coming out of slavery if I'm not going to make sacrifices to God? What's the use of coming out of Egypt if I'm not going to bring God some offerings? You know, there's people think they can come out of the world, and in the world they're dedicated. Some of you had habits that you couldn't break. You was dedicated to those habits of sin. And then you want to come into the church and you don't want to bring God any good habits, any dedication, any service, any sacrifices, any offerings of lifestyle. The thinking's wrong, and the world keeps trying to give us a new mentality. That's why the pulpit cannot get silent, and it cannot quit speaking the word of the Lord. This sacred desk, it may be just some wood and formica, and it may just be a man behind it, but I'm going to tell you, if it ever gets silent, the church is in trouble, because you got to hear the other side of what God is saying. You got to hear, thus saith the Lord, because there's a devil saying, hath God said, and I want to tell you, God did say. God did say. God did say. Now notice what happens in verse 26. Moses waxes eloquent and bold, and he says, our cattle also shall go with us. There shall not an hoof be left behind. When you come to God, you got to bring Him everything. When you come to God, you don't leave some things as they are. You know, I remember Brother Barnes, who was a mentor and dear friend of mine, even though there was a huge age gap between us. He would tell me, we'd be talking, and he had a saying that he said several times. He said, I don't even want the devil to have a used toothpick of mine. And another conversation, we'd be talking about spiritual things, and somewhere that'd pop up. He said, I don't even want the devil to have a used toothpick of mine. It got drilled in my head. Whether I'm going to use it or not, I surely don't want the devil to have it if it belonged to me at one time. If I put it in the trash, I want it to stay in the trash. I don't want him taking it out and using it on somebody else. If I put it under the blood, I don't want him taking it up and bringing it and parading it back through. I don't want the devil to have my old life or this new life. I want him to go find some other way of living in some other sinful place, but leave my life alone.